Welcome to our program, Colonel Sweet and Mark Toth.
Hey, thanks for having us back on the program, Daniel.
Great to be here, Daniel. Thank you.
US President Donald Trump met with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Putin did not make a single concession and didn't agree to a full ceasefire. Colonel Sweet, what is your assessment of the results of this summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump?
Well, it certainly wasn't the outcome that many analysts and political pundits expected. They expected the president to go in with a heavy hand concerning sanctions and other tools of national power to get some sort of ceasefire agreement from President Putin. And that clearly that wasn't the outcome. So we leave the summit without a ceasefire, wanting to skip a step and going straight to a peace deal. And I think it's left a lot of folks, one in Ukraine, but also in Europe, concerned about the way ahead and about what Monday looks like. Because what it really sounds as though is that President Trump is just simply going to pass along the demands of Putin to Ukraine and hope that Zelensky buys into it. And by all accounts, I don't think he's going to do that. So.
And Mark, what is your take on this summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump and the possible outcome of this summit for the war in Ukraine and its influence on the current situation in Ukraine?
Yeah, in terms of Alaska, it wasn't as advertised, right? I mean, we were told that if a ceasefire wasn't achieved, that Trump was going to demand that sanctions be put in place. He certainly had those tools available to him by the U.S. Senate to go ahead and effect that. And that didn't happen. And I think anyone, it doesn't take an analyst like me or John, to look at the optics of what was occurring during that summit. Putin basically got everything he wanted, a photo opportunity, a chance to lecture people on the history of Russia and its interactions with the U.S. and why they're such a great ally, which they're not. And a chance to also do some propaganda with respect to the origins of Alaska and Russian influence there, even bringing in the church, the concept that the Russian church extends into Alaska from its own ownership days. So from my standpoint of view, Alaska was a complete failure. And I think what that's setting up right now, what we're potentially seeing today, or at least what I'm most concerned about, is this is about blaming Zelensky now for this failure that happened at the summit. And if you read Trump's face at the post-summit news conference with Putin, he didn't look like a guy that won anything. But Trump being Trump is trying to spin this as a way of winning. And so, my fears today, especially this first meeting, before the European leaders can get involved and support Zelensky in terms of what Europe's red lines are, what Ukraine's red lines should be going forward in negotiations with Russia. My fear this is about setting up Zelensky to fail, only to save face for Trump. And so that's some dangerous territory.
Let's also cover the main developments during this historic summit in Alaska. According to Bloomberg, after meeting with Putin, Donald Trump had a phone conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky and other European allies. Trump told Zelensky that Putin would like Ukraine to withdraw troops from the whole Donbas region in exchange for a full ceasefire, for ending the hostilities. On the ground, Colonel Sweet, what does this mean? Is Donald Trump just playing this role of mediator in this war, or is Donald Trump just siding with Vladimir Putin, his position, his demands, or maybe Donald Trump just doesn't care about the details of the deal? He just wants to get this done.
I think that's a great question. And my concern is that the president wants a peace deal. Okay, we all want a peace deal, but I think he wants the peace deal for the wrong reasons. And I believe those reasons are in the form of business deals, in the form of rare earth minerals, in the form of property, not a peace deal that's in the form of national security interests for Ukraine or national security or NATO, for that matter, not national security, but rather the security of Eastern Europe. So my concern is that he's simply now taking the position of, I'm just going to pass along what those requirements are, and we'll see if Zelensky takes it. Now, some of his social media posts have been a little bit alarming too, saying that he needs to take the deal. Now's the time. But I'm not sure it's a deal. It's not a deal for Ukraine. And at the end of the day, it's really more of a condition setter for future Russian aggression. Whereas the fortified belts are taken away, you lose, in a sense, the connective tissue between Crimea and the other occupied territories. It's not a good deal, I don't think, it's for Zelensky, but Zelensky and Europe are going to have to look at this proposal and decide whether or not these security guarantees that have been discussed, but not in detail, are enough to bring them to the negotiating table. But to Zelensky's caution, the last security guarantee he got in the form of a Budapest memo wasn't worth the paper that was written on. So he's really got to give a lot of thought to this. He's got to turn to his NATO allies and say, what are my options? But we'll see.
And Mark, what is your assessment of Donald Trump's position right now? What is his position on this war and how this war should be settled?
Daniel, that's another great question. And I don't know if you can quite tell, but here in Pasadena, California, it's hazy today. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now in terms of trying to understand what Trump is really after here. I think if we start at Trump's words, where Trump likes to say, this is Biden's war, this wouldn't have happened had he been president, and pinning it on him, great, fine, right? That's the origin. But it's Putin that was the origin, not Biden himself. In terms of going forward, though, any kind of peace deal, and I use that word lightly, and I'll explain that in a minute, but any kind of peace deal is going to be Trump's peace deal. And right now, as I sit back and I try to analyze this and I look at the different things that people are arguing this peace deal should look like, gee, it looks like Putin's peace deal. It looks like everything that Putin wants, withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from all of the Donbass, which would mean the elimination of the Fortress Belt that has been basically the bulwark that has stopped Russia, as my youngest son's generation would say, running riot over the rest of Ukraine. That's, in my opinion, setting up military suicide. The peace deal means that Crimea stays in Russian hands, that they're just able to annex that these other areas, the other oblasts, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, all become part of Russia too. I mean, where is any concession, any tangible substantive concession that Putin is making? Maybe save a promise, with his hands behind his back and fingers crossed, that he won't invade Ukraine going forward. I do think, and I'll refer to Valina Chakarova, analyst friend of John's and mine. She pointed out between 2014 and 2022, there were 29 different ceasefires between Ukraine and Russia. Every single one of them failed. So, look, if there's a peace deal that happens, if Trump is pursuing that kind of peace in his mind, I think what he doesn't yet understand and needs to is that peace, by definition, to Putin simply means pause. He's only going to pause what he's trying to accomplish in Ukraine and ultimately pause what he's after in the rest of Eastern Europe.
And Colonel Sweet, I would like to remind our viewers and people around the globe, what would this possible withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donbass mean for the outcome of this war? Why does Putin want Ukraine to withdraw from the Donbass, and what could this mean for the outcome of this war?
Well, so what the conditions being that the Ukraine withdraws from the oblast, you assume that there's going to be a frozen conflict, that border walls will be established. You also assume that there'll be some sort of force on the west side of the wall, whether it's EU or NATO, and some sort of force on the east side of the wall being Russia. But what it affords Russia is the opportunity to reset their military, to continue to stockpile drones and ballistic missiles, to build new capacity in the forms of armor and artillery, and then ultimately, and you name it, it could be 6 months, it could be 3 to 5 years. All the analysts in NATO think 3 to 5 years he's going to make a play on one of the NATO countries. But it's just a matter of time before he resets, recocks, and he goes back across the border in one failing swoop, if you will, into Odessa, and then turning north up into Kiev. And oh, by the way, on the way up, reinforcing Transnistria and taking Moldova. because let's remember Moldova is also a non-NATO, non-EU country too. So in the long term, in my opinion, it's simply setting conditions for Russia to reset, rebuild, back it up, and do it again. And that is the history of Russia, both in the Putin administration and previous administrations too. That's just who they are.
You just mentioned about the possible security guarantees. There are lots of discussions because Steve Witkoff has been saying in American media that the US ready to provide Ukraine with kind of security guarantees like the Article 5, but without NATO's involvement. According to Axios, even US boots on the ground are being discussed in the White House. Right now, however, it seems to be not really clear how this would look like and what are the main details of this deal, the possible deal. Colonel Svita, what is your opinion about the possibility of the US putting boots on the ground to Ukraine, and would this be worth it? Even would this boots on the ground be worth it if Ukraine withdraws from Donbas region?
Yeah, I don't think we're ever going to see U.S. boots on the ground. Okay, maybe in the form of advisors, but not in the form of peacekeeping soldiers. I just don't see we're going to see that. I don't think we're going to see NATO forces on the ground too. Russia's been very adamant about non-NATO, non-U.S. forces in Ukraine, period. They've also been adamant about stopping weapons sales, okay, and removing any type of long-range strike capability. It's, in a sense, neutering the Ukrainian military. I just don't think that's going to happen. Even though Russia says that they would be okay with Ukraine entering into the European Union doesn't provide a security guarantee. European Union has a military force. Let's remember the European Union military force is comprised of countries that are also in NATO. So I doubt that he's going to accept European Union forces in Ukraine either. I don't understand the security guarantees. Maybe if it's fleshed out more in the media right now, it's all talk and discussion based upon leaks, inside sources. But the last security guarantee that was provided to Ukraine, the Budapest memo signed by President Clinton, right, didn't provide much guarantee when they needed it. Okay. Article 5 provides that guarantee. Article 5-like guarantees don't necessarily mean that you're going to get what you need when you need it.
And Mark, what is your take on the possibility of Ukraine getting kind of security guarantee from the US, and why does American officials right now are pushing this topic of security guarantees? Are they trying to justify their position regarding the war in Ukraine?
Daniel, I kind of look at this on multiple levels. One is just perplexing. Article 5 only really means something if you bring the whole gang. General Mark Hertling, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, I believe, had also basically said the same thing, that if you're going to fight a bull, you bring the whole gang. And so why you would simply isolate the U.S. off from that and say, no, it's not going to be NATO, it would just be the U.S. in some kind of Article 5-like scenario doesn't make sense to me, because ultimately what really backs up Article 5 is the U.S. nuclear arsenal. But you don't want to go to that first, right? That kind of tripwire is dangerous. You certainly want a conventional component to it that can deter, Russian aggression on the ground. So that I'm somewhat surprised. But again, that's Steve Witkoff articulating that. This is a guy that can't even get Putin's talking points correct that he brought back with him. He misunderstood the positions ahead of Alaska. So I'm a little bit leery as an analyst to step back and say, let's pay too close of attention to Steve Witkoff's words, because as he proved over the weekend, he just seems incredibly naive. He was touting on U.S. Sunday media shows that, oh, wow, great. You know what? Putin's going to put into writing and maybe even enshrine it into the Constitution that they would not invade the rest of Ukraine. And I think for those of us that have followed Russia closely is like, what part of their constitution already does Putin follow? I mean, we all see the people jumping out of windows, supposedly getting pushed. He imprisons press people, imprisons his political opponents. And this is not a man who cares about constitutional law. So, if suddenly Ukraine is banned by that, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean zilch. So from my standpoint, look, I maintain a maximalist position here. I do think that there should be a NATO guarantee. I think the best way to accomplish that is Ukraine becoming part of NATO. But for now, it's pretty clear that Trump is not going to allow that. That would be an obstacle for Putin. But I think that's what you've got to get to. And if for some reason you get to this point where you have some kind of withdrawal, it is going to take NATO troops on the ground. I mean, that is a big defensive ask of any military. And if you take away that fortress belt, and again, I personally think that Ukraine should reject that. That should just be a non-starter. Europe should reject that. The politicians that are accompanying Zelensky today to the White House should say, that's a non-starter. But I just don't get that. You're creating a nightmare to defend. And as I said earlier in the segment, I think if that scenario comes about, it becomes one of military suicide for Ukraine. And just real quickly, the reason why, to answer your question, that Trump was pushing this in his officials, I think they're covering up because they don't have military guys at the table. As much as we could best see, John and I both were commenting on this to ourselves, we didn't see, a Petraeus or a General Hodges or anyone like that advising them during this negotiations. It was glaring that there was not someone in the military that was representing their interests in the close talks. So I think this is just they're trying to put a Band-Aid over a huge sore, but Article 5 is not going to do that in this vein. Again, I think it's a little bit of misdirection. And while U.S. security agreements or guarantees would be welcomed, they got to have more teeth than what I've seen so far out of Trump's mouth.
Also, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that no one would force Ukraine to cede territory to Russia. Mark, what is your take on this statement? Do you feel that there could be some different positions inside Trump's team on how to move forward with this war?
Yeah, Daniel, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I think this is where it gets dangerous. If you look at the verbiage being used by Rubio and you look at some of the echoes that you're seeing in statements that have been made by Macron of France, of Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, they're using similar language. But the devil's in the details and the devil's in the wordsmithing that's happening here. They're not going to have a situation where it's simply Russia gets awarded these territories, but the pressure appears to me to be on to Ukraine to voluntarily give up these territories, to cede them, etc., is part of that. So they are hiding behind that verbiage of saying, no, the territorial integrity remains sacrosanct of Ukraine, but wink, wink, if you happen to give it up, that would be great. And there's been enough signaling, for instance, in terms of chatter coming from Washington, D.C., and on Capitol Hill, different senators saying this, that, look, you're not going to get back Crimea, things like that. Well, isn't that already a territorial concession? Isn't what the White House and Washington basically saying? If you're messaging through the political leadership in Washington, D.C., that you are going to be making concessions. So I would be very careful here because I think this, while it's encouraging at a high altitude level of what they're saying, when you dig down past it and the gamesmanship that's going on, they still very much want Ukraine to cut its own throat. And I think Ukraine should say no. I think it really still needs to be a red line here for them and their European partners to say we're not going to play that game.
There are also lots of discussions in the media that President Zelensky is right now faces difficult position because he cannot really agree with such an offer from US President Trump and Vladimir Putin on ceding the whole Donbass area. However, if he declines this offer, he risks to face another bad reaction, terrible reaction from US President Donald Trump, who could also halt all military support for Ukraine and also intelligence sharing. What are the risks of that? And can Ukraine really decline this offer without facing any kind of terrible consequences? What is your take on that, Colonel Sweet?
Well, I think that really depends upon the support that the NATO countries are willing to provide Ukraine. NATO is willing to continue to step up weapons and intelligence sharing and munitions. Then I think it's less of an issue. Look, what the Secretary of State said, and I'll go back to Mark's comments about Ukraine doesn't have any pressure concerning the territory and the concessions, but they do, because again, if they decline not to, then I think you're going to see the Trump administration saying, well, Ukraine doesn't want peace, therefore we're out, and they're going to withdraw, their financial support and other types of support they've been providing Ukraine. So that is a lot of pressure. And look, when you're the president and you have the weight on the world on your shoulders, and you have to make a decision about the fate, the outcome of your country, you have to weigh a lot of inputs. And one of those inputs is, do I have the United States on my side? And if I don't, do I have NATO on my side that can make up the difference? And quite frankly, I don't know what the right answer to that is. I know the president is going to meet, obviously, with Zelensky for a short amount of time, and all of the senior, if you will, leaders of mostly Western NATO later this afternoon. So he's certainly in a tough position, and the Ukrainian constitution pretty much mandates that he doesn't have the ability to cede terrain. So tough sometimes being the president, and we'll see just how he presents himself today in the White House. But we certainly don't want to see another incident where he gets into a verbal altercation with the vice president or the president and he's escorted out of the building. That's not the outcome we're looking for, but that's certainly the outcome Putin would like, and I think Putin thinks he set the conditions for that.
Thank you, Colin Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Hey, thanks for having us back on the show, Daniel.
Take care, Daniel.